All right, thank you everyone for joining me this evening for a little bit of Figma tutorials, some information. Tonight we're going to cover components, constraints, and auto layout. Nothing too crazy, just the basics really. And this was a request from an individual on Slack, and always very willing to help with these things. Of course, I am recording this so it can be watched at a later time. And this evening we will begin with components, how they work, a couple of concepts that underline the idea. And I made bullet points to go over these briefly. Components they're reusable elements, and that ties heavily into one of the big design concepts, DRY, D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself. This is an instance of work smarter, not harder. When you are using components, you'll be able to create instances and use them over and over and over again without having to redesign the same elements over and over. So it's a big time saver. Second of all, much like almost everything in Figma, it observes a parent and child hierarchy, with the component itself being the parent and child being the instance. And I'll discuss a little bit more about how that works once we start to make them. And then let's see here, we have inheritance, changes, and overrides. And that'll become more apparent once we start to make them. But basically, the component itself is the parent object, and any changes made to the component will be inherited by the children, which are called instances. Changes made to the children are called overrides, and they will not reflect, or their changes won't reflect any change in the parent, the component. So you can create a component, place an instance, make some changes to it, and it won't have any effect on the parent. Now, there are some options available a bit more advanced where you can have an instance and tell it to update the parent, but that is for another video. And lastly, one can nest instances and components into larger components. So you have a component that's made up of instances, so on and so forth. So you can make some complex design elements for use in your designs. And so to begin, we will create a very simple component so we can learn how they work, what they look like, and how they interact, and how they in some ways don't interact with their children, that is to say, their instances. So a component is made up, or you tell an object to become a component by either clicking this create component icon here at the top, and that will be visible anytime you have a layer item selected, such as this shape, this oval. And you can click this icon here. It's like 4 diamonds together. Another way of doing it is right-clicking and going to, let's see here, create component, sort of about 2/3 the way down the list. Or as you can see here, at least on my Mac, the shortcut is Option Command K, and I'm a huge fan of keyboard shortcuts, but for the sake of this video, I'll try to remember to use more easily visible mouse controls. And so let's make this a bit more interesting. And so we have this oval here. Let's give it some style, some arbitrary style. I'm a big fan right now of this sort of, salmonish color. And we'll also apply a stroke. And let's see here, I'll scrub it to about 8. That sounds good. Inside's fine with me. And let's say that we want it to have, some text element. Let's not get too crazy. And so, actually, that's not bad. So I'll put a text element in there. Let's say I want an uppercase A. And so I'll take this A, I'll put it in the middle. I'll go ahead and scale that up. I pressed K. So when you have your normal cursor here, which is one of the move tools where you can select and move it, if you press K, it changes the tool. Now there's no visual indication. The cursor still looks like the cursor. However, when you select an element and the bounding box appears and you put the cursor over this handle, you'll see that we have a more stylized version of the Move tool's double-headed arrow. And so this is the regular Move tool right here, and press K, and now we can see we have the Move tool's double-headed arrow, but it has a white stroke. And what that is the scale tool. And so if we select just the text object element, we can now scale this up, and this is a fun way of determining font height, font size, without having to put it in over here. Anyway, so let's go ahead and center that. We're going to group that together. That was Command G. You can also right click and group selection. I like grouping things together. You don't want to rely too heavily on groups, but it's helpful when you're keeping like elements together. And so in order to create a component out of this group, we'll call that a circle. I'll go ahead and select the group here and either right click and go to create component, or again, once we have the group selected in the layers panel, we can also click this button up here, which same thing, create component. So I'll go ahead and click that, and you'll notice at the very least two things changed. So the bounding box, which was previously blue, has now changed to a purple color. This text down here, which shows the dimensions, is now has a purple fill. And over here, the group icon has changed to this 4 diamond icon, and it is now purple as well. Purple seems to be the theme for components in Figma. And now this is the parent object. This is the component. And it inherits the name of the group, so it didn't rename itself like component 1 or just component. It's still called a circle, but we know it's a component because of this iconography here. And now what we can do is we can place multiple instances. We can place children of this component. And so the way to do that is I hold down Shift and I press I, which brings up this components window, this components modal, and it's going to automatically list the local components, that is to say the ones specific to this draft, this document. But if for some reason you had many components and this was a scrollable list, you could always, when you bring up this window, it automatically focuses on the search field. So you would type in, a portion of the name, which would be, you can even misspell it if you want to, circle, and if you click that, it's hard to see because this was on top, it placed an instance. Okay, so let's talk about instances versus components. So an instance has exactly the same color thing going on, in that the bounding box is purple, dimensions are purple. Over here, the name of the layer or the name of the component is also in purple. And it retains the same name as the parent. It doesn't name itself a circle 1 or a circle 2 or whatever the case may be, a circle child. It just calls itself a circle. However, there's iconography that helps us determine that we're dealing with an instance. And whereas the component, the parent element, has the 4 diamond iconography over here in the layers panel, the instance, or the child element, has it has a larger hollow or just simply stroked with no fill diamond icon. And that's how you determine the difference between the two. And you can place as many instances or as many children elements that you want. And that's just using the Shift I keyboard shortcut to bring up the components panel. And so place another one, Shift I, circle, place another one, and you can create an infinite amount. And so let's get rid of these last two. And so let's do this is the parent, or just the component, and this is the child. Let's do that. Okay, so because this is the parent element, the component, any change that's made to the parent, the child will inherit. There's sort of a family tree hierarchy structure going on, which is common across many design tools and many design disciplines. It just makes things easier. Things sort of flow downhill, so to speak. And so if we were to make a change to the parent, let's say we'll select this layer, this component, which you can tell it is still grouped. It's just the component is the group, so it actually has the text element and the ellipse itself. But we'll select the entirety of the component, the entire group. And over here on the design panel, we see that we have the selection colors. And the selection colors is a terribly useful way of getting sort of a bird's eye view of all the different colors that go into what is in the group, so you can change things en masse should you need to. And I could, for example, I could select this entire group, this component, and I could change the fill color of the oval by selecting, by clicking the color that I see is the fill over here, which is again this sort of salmon color, and then changing the color here. And as you can see, when let's find a nicer color, there we go. You can tell that because I'm changing the component, the parent color, I changed it from that orangish salmon color to, I don't know, this sort of baby blue color. The child has inherited the qualities of that component. And so no matter what you change this to, it's going to be reflected in the child. And so that's an okay color. I like that. And so, you know, changes made in the component will be reflected in the child. However, let's say that, let's place another one right quick, circle. Okay, and this is another child object, so let's just call that children. Ooh, there we go. Okay, so if we wanted to, for whatever reason, and this comes up frequently in design, especially when you're changing text like buttons, very, very common in buttons, and I suppose I could show an example of that. If we made a change to one of the child objects, it will not update the parent. It'll just be an override. And so let's say that for this component, I wanted to have, I wanted to change the background color. And so I know it's a child, it's an instance, because if I look over here, it has the hollow, larger diamond icon. Whoop. Didn't mean to do that. There we go. Let's say I wanted to change just the background color here. Well, I could go into the properties of or I could go over here to the layers panel and click the drop down arrow for the circle instance, select the ellipse, and change it. And this is just another way of changing color. You can also do the selection colors method as I just did. If we wanted to change just the background color on this child, we could find a color that we like. Let's try something, yeah, nice yellow. So we can tell that even though we made changes to this instance, it does not affect the parent in any way. And as you can see here, both of these are child objects. Both of these are instances of this component here, the parent. Let me move that out of the way. Changes made to a child does not affect its siblings. And so these are both children. Changes made here only affect it, does not affect siblings, does not affect the parent. And so that's a good use of making small changes to the instances. And just as a side note, and this is a preference of mine, of course this is not a rule or anything like that, I really don't like having my components, my parent objects, I don't like them I don't like having them on the canvas where I'm creating the bulk of my work. I like sequestering it to its own page, so I don't accidentally get rid of it or goof it up or lose it in the mix or whatever the case may be. So how I like to do that is, or what I do, my method when I'm creating components, is I'll go to the layers panel And so I have a page, usually this is just called like page 1, but I double clicked and I renamed it Figma stuff, and you can double click it and rename it what you want. I start off by clicking the plus icon here, which is add new page, and when you click that, it adds the page and it takes you to that page. And so you might think that all of your work has exited the canvas, but no, it's still there. It just switched to a new canvas. And so we're going to call this components. It doesn't really matter what you call it. You just need to know what it is. And each page will have its own layers as it starts to fill up. And so components has nothing on the canvas right now, so that there aren't any layers. If I click back to Figma stuff, well, here are all my layers. And as I said, I like to create my components in a different page just to keep everything separate, to keep everything clean. And if I wanted to create another component, I will go to my pages, which I called components. And let's say I wanted to create a button. And let's see here, this is going to involve a little bit of the auto layout feature. And I will discuss that separately in a little bit, but I just want to, and you can syncretize the two lessons here. Once I get to the next part, I'm going to, let's see here, create a button, and I want the text of the button to be text. When I'm creating buttons or input fields or any sort of elements like that, any sort of UI pattern, I try, if it involves text, I try to just have it say something very generic so that I know I can, delete the text that's currently there and write whatever text may be appropriate. Like if I make a button, the component will say text, but in instance might say log in or create new account or whatever it's called for in the design. So I'm going to create a button called text, and you'll notice I began creating this component just with the text itself. And so text is what I like, and I want to make that a frame. Everything is based on frames in Figma. It's frames all the way down. If you don't already have a habit of using frames for nearly everything, go ahead and start doing that now. Just make your life a lot easier. And so the keyboard shortcut is Option Command G, or you can right click on an element, this text element specifically, and we'll go ahead and say we're going to frame selection. And it looks like nothing changed really, except now we know it's a frame because being in a nested frame, that is a frame not in another frame, it has a name up here, which is frame 1, and components are frames, so to speak. And so we can rename that. I'm just going to call this button, and that updates the name of it over here. And of course, if you rename it here, it'll rename it here. And so we'll just go back to calling that button. And it has the regular frame icon. And so I want to give this a fill. Right now it has a transparent fill, and I can turn the default fill on. It's automatic on my machine anyway. I don't know if this is Figma's default. It's hidden, which is this icon here. This is meant to be a closed eye, and we can tell that it's hidden because this 100% which represents the transparency value, as well as this hex value, which is completely white, is hidden. And if we click this eye, the eye opens up, as you can tell. And of course, because the text I wrote was white, it was a hex value of FFF, it's going to completely obscure all the text. But we're going to go ahead and change the fill, and to be specific, the fill that we are changing is that of the frame itself. And so we can change it to, I don't know, let's find a nice blue. Sure, something like that. I'm sure that won't satisfy WebAIM or WCAG, but that'll work for this tutorial. And so I like the way that looks as far, and when I say that, I mean I like the color of the white text on top of the blue background. Work sans, that's my font. And so by selecting the frame, and again, a repeat of the sort of family tree hierarchy, the frame itself is the parent and the text element is the child. And when you select and this is also a group, so when you select the parent, it also will select all child elements. So we're going to go ahead and select the parent, and we're going to turn that into a component. And so we can right click. Let's see here. I never use this menu. We can hit create component, and we can tell it's a component now because purple all the way around, and it has the 4 diamonds here, and it kept the name that the frame had, which is super useful. And let's see here. And of course we can make it wider, do whatever we want to with it. I'm going to add, and I'm not quite to the auto layout portion yet, but just for the sake of making it look okay, I'm going to add an auto layout, go to middle here. I'm going to, actually I don't want to scrub that. I'm going to increase the horizontal padding as well as scrub in some vertical padding. That looks better. By no means does it look good, but it looks better. And so in this canvas on this page, which is called components, I have a component which is called button. And of course I had to make it a component just because it's on this page that is called components. When I create anything, it doesn't automatically make it a component. Like I could place an oval and it's just a regular shape. It's just a regular ellipse. It's not a component. You have to make it a component. And so I'll go back to the Figma stuff pages. And if I wanted to place and again, it keeps it nice and clean. I don't have any components. And whenever I use components, typically I only ever use instances. The component, the parent itself, will not be part of the design. It'll just be a series of instances. Components, as far as my design regimen is concerned, I keep all parents separated from their children, which is an odd way of saying that, but components have the parents have their own page. Children/instances hang out in the actual design. So I'll hold down Shift, I'll press I. It already loaded my local component. Since I deleted the old component, a circle, it's going to find what it sees on this draft document, which is button. I'm going to click button, and we just placed our text button. And let's say, obviously, in our design, we don't want this to say text. That's not a call to action. That doesn't mean anything. And so, and we know this is an instance because it has the large stroke only, no fill diamond iconography over here. I can press T, which is my text tool, click once in the middle here. It's difficult to see against the background, but I'm doing Command A, which is select all. I can begin making a new button, and I didn't mean for that to run off the side there. And so this is the text, and it could say anything you want it to. And you notice because it's auto layout, it's keeping the padding in check, which is beyond useful. And so this is the instance, and just to double check that it didn't change anything, because I know it didn't, with the parent, I'll go back over here. There's our regular button. And so we can place, and provided we design a button that we like, we can place buttons all day and change their wording, or we can add icon to it, whatever the case may be. And so an example of what that could look like when you're getting very much into the weeds with your high fidelity mockups, we could go to something I was working on, go to my components tab here. I have several components I made when I was going through trying to figure out exactly what I liked. And this would typically say text, but it says login. This is sort of more of a rounded button, or that has 50% border radius. This has, I think, probably 8. I was fixated on 8 for some reason. This has a border radius of 8, so it's in between complete border radius of 50% and a border radius of 0. And there are also components I created here where I have text, but I also have an icon that I was using, the Google Material icon Figma file for, so I could quickly create some buttons that also had iconography, and I made buttons that had text on the right, icon on the left, and then the switch of that, and then I also made variants. So let's briefly talk about variants and how they work, because this is some pretty powerful stuff, and this will allow you to prototype a lot quicker and test out designs. If you're making a variant, and you just make one, for example, that could aid you in a process such as like A/B testing, where you're asking yourself or another designer or your mentor, whomever, what looks better, this button style or this button style, and you could quickly go between the two. And so with the component selected, we're in the components page, and we're looking at this component here, which is the button. I will right click on it, and there should be where is let's see here. I forget exactly where it is to make. I should have looked this up beforehand, exactly how to make a variant of this. And see if I right click here, move to page selection frame, main component. Okay, yeah, there it is. So if you right click and go to main component, you can add variant, and this should be the same thing as create variant. And you will see that the variant, and it'll always make it below. It puts the variant below, and it makes a copy of the component exactly. So these two look exactly the same. And you'll know you're working with a component that has a variant attached to it because it has this purple dashed with a padding of however many pixels, not exactly a bounding box, but a border box that when you mouse over like that, it becomes more like a 2-pixel stroke around the thing. Anyway, but it has its own bounding box for the variant. And let's say I wanted to create a variant because I didn't know what would look best with my design. Did I want a button that has corners that don't have any border radius, as you can tell over here, corner radius. I'm used to CSS. The corner radius is set to 0, which is why we have 90-degree angles right here. And for the variant, which as you can see here, the variant added itself to the button group, to the button component, and it called itself variant 2. There was no variant 1, but I'm not sure where that comes from. Anyway, one of the peculiarities of working with Figma. And for this button, I want to test out what this design would look like if I added a corner radius. And I can click to hold in this area when I see the double-headed arrow, and I can scrub in a value, or of course if I knew exactly what I wanted, like 12, I could type in 12 there, and now the variant of course does not affect the parent because they're sort of siblings in a way. I would need to visualize that to speak in a more educated way on it. And of course you can change any number of things, including any element. If you wanted to change the font, like let's make that something like, I don't know, whatever that is, Windy 1. We now have a variant that has a different font attached to it, as well as a corner radius on all 4 sides of value 12. And so this is the button component. We have a variant attached to it, and it says 2 variants, I guess. When you have one component, it's just the component, but when you add a variant, they're both considered variants, now that I see this. And you could add an additional one by pressing, by clicking or tapping on the plus icon right here. That would add a new variant. And you can make, I haven't tested how many variants you can make, because I usually don't try to test more than 2 or 3 at a time. Try to keep the spirit of A/B testing alive and well. It makes everything a lot faster. But if you wanted to add variants, you could continue to do so by just clicking the plus. And as you can tell, when I clicked the plus, it added, of course, another variant, and it based it on the original, the first variant, I guess you would call that, because that's variant 2. And so I'm going to Command Z to undo that. And so I will select the variant 2, and this is the default, and this is variant 2. And so I'm going to call this button variant, or variant, I can't spell, variant corner radius. That's what we're going to call that. And let's see here. Property 1, current variant. Yeah, and you can make that the default if you want to over here with the current variant panel on the design panel. And oh no, it doesn't like the name. Let's see here. It says this layer has an invalid name. We'll call this CR for corner radius. It doesn't like that either. Well, we can deal with that. Okay, so we have our button and we have our variant with this error that I'm not exactly sure how to deal with right now, but I'm not going to worry about it. And so if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've worked with variants. If I wanted to show what the variant was, I would select, or what it would look like, I would select my child or my instance here, my child object. And now under button, we have additional information right here. And so, darn it, it's not doing it. We're gonna call that button. So, property one. Okay, there we go, got rid of the error. So what it didn't like was the previous name of the current variant. So I renamed it CR for corner radius. And let's go back to Figma stuff. Sorry for the interruption there. And so, yeah, now it works. Okay, so this is the original instance, and we renamed it, or we typed in anything for the text. Of course, it could say anything. And so we're going to, and you can duplicate it, which is essentially the same thing as placing a new instance. I could duplicate it, I could hit Shift-I, any number of ways to create a copy of this instance. And so we have this instance, and this line of text right here, it says property one and value. That will not appear if the component or the instance you're looking at has no variance. But in this case, we have a variant, which I renamed CR for corner radius. And so selecting this child, this instance, the drop-down box here, default, we will select CR, and it changed, which is based on the font size, I guess. It changed some of the aspects. So the variant had a different font. It had Windy 1, and it also had a rounded, it had a corner radius value greater than 0, or anything other than 0, I should say. Greater than, and that is reflective in the variant we had here. And so doing this, you could quickly set up various versions of what a design element would look like. And so you could do some testing that way. That might affect your usability testing if you're doing A/B, anything like that. And that is essentially all there is. Well, not all there is, but that is all you need to get started with components. And components, as you can see here, are grouped items. They're in a frame. Everything's a frame in Figma. And you can make all sorts of changes to your instances. They will act as overrides. You can change, the text of whatever you want to, and it will not affect the parent. As we can see here, it's still text. And it'll also not affect its siblings. And so that covers your overrides, your inheritances, and the reusability. And of course, always think of ways to keep you want to have your designs be as dry as possible. And I don't mean bland. Of course, I mean capital D, capital R, capital Y. Don't repeat yourself. You could spend, and there's two reasons for that. You don't want to repeat yourself because A, you would waste time if you had to make buttons over and over and over again by hand. You also run the risk of, depending on complexity of element, making a mistake. It happens. If you're making the same button over and over again without copy and paste, if you're making 5 of these anything buttons and redoing each step each time, you might be, in some scenarios, you might be 1 pixel off on the width of your frame here, or your fill might have a hex value that's off by 1 character. And so, and if you copy and paste that, these issues, these errors, they start to, they'll propagate throughout your design. And so by having components and reusing them, when you place an instance, you always have, you're always starting at exactly the same spot. And so you're a lot safer with your design, and you're less likely to make mistakes that way. Ooh, let's see. And so that is some of the basics of components. Let's see here. The next bit I was going to talk about, let me check the chat right quick here. One moment. I'm using an older Surface tablet for my second monitor, and it's not terribly responsive. Let's see here. I want to make sure I'm not missing any commentary. Okay, excellent. So the next topic for this evening's discussion on some of the Figma basics is, let's see here, we did components. Let's talk about constraints. And constraints are they have their use, and it's not, as in my estimation, I could be wrong, it's not always as useful as components. I can see how it could be when you are designing for multiple devices that have drastically different viewports, dimensions. For example, if you were working on iOS or if you're working on Mac devices, and if your product owner said, I need this product to work on Apple Watch, iPhones 8 and above, the Maxes, the Pros, the Pro Maxes, what have you, MacBooks, whatever else they have out these days that have very specific screen constraints. You want to, of course, don't repeat yourself, but also you want to keep it as simple as possible. And constraints are very useful when you are prototyping and you need to quickly design screens of different dimensions, different layouts, like horizontal versus vertical, and you need your elements to stay put. You need them to stay where you put them, regardless of how your frames start to move around. And so the idea here is, which is another idea that's very big in web design, it all sort of ties together, is responsive design. You want everything to be responsive. And the way constraints work is it sets that there's a distance related to the frame boundary. And what we mean by that is, let's draw a frame. And so I tap F. You could also go up here and click this icon. And let's see here, I'm just going to click, and it did create a frame. It's just it has no fill, so it's taking on the background color of this frame. And of course, nested frames do not have their title at the top. So while this frame called constraints has its title right here, its layer name, this one does not, because frames inside of frames lose that. And so we're going to go ahead and give it a fill, something dark but not difficult to see for streaming purposes. I'm going to give it a width of, 300 by 7. I don't like that. 300 by 600. There we go. Something mobile-ish. And so this is your frame, and we'll just call that mobile. And I bring this up almost every time, but whenever you are making your designs in Figma, or any design tool for that matter, if it's Sketch, XD, anything that has layers, so a lot of the Creative Cloud applications, Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, so on and so forth, their layout panel is almost exclusively on the right. I'm not sure if you can change that. It's been a while since I've used them, but whenever you place a new item, it has a very generic name, which is sort of self-descriptive to the type of layer it is or the type of shape. Always rename your layers, because when you get deep into your high fidelity mockups, such as when you have an artboard, or when you're working on a canvas that has hundreds of items, you want to make sure that and there's an instance of me not doing that, like frame 2, I should have renamed that. All of these are named semantically. I don't have to guess what this auto layout frame is. I know that it's a tag of type, or it's a tag of type accessible. I have a certain naming convention. Always name your stuff semantically and do it immediately. There's a background and a top background, so you know what it is the second you look at it, and you don't have to wonder what rectangle 52 is in reference to, or ellipse 393. You know what it is. Just name your stuff the second you lay it down. And I'm guilty of not always doing that, but my advice is do as I say, not as I do. And so we have this frame here. I called it mobile. We'll just call it mobile screen. And of course, if you wanted a very specific dimension, I pressed F to bring up the contextual panel under design for the different frame sizes. Figma comes preloaded with many different frame sizes. It gives short shrift to the Android. It just has Android small and Android large, much to my chagrin, being a Pixel user. So we could choose any of one of the modern iPhones we wanted to, but I'm just going with a generic frame size here, and we'll call it mobile screen. So let's say that we have an element, and that element is going to be one of those sort of floating call to action buttons. And so let's go ahead and design that quickly. I'll use a plus. Now these pluses aren't, it's not exactly aligned to the pixel grid. And so if I wanted to create a perfect, completely symmetric cross, I would just, use the shape tool, do some Boolean operations, and flatten it and all that good stuff. But this suffices. Actually, I guess I could flatten it. So I'm going to put it in the middle here. Let's go ahead and make that a bit larger. That looks good. And again, I'm just creating what's going to be a floating call to action button. And let's see here, 46, 46, 83, 83. Let's go ahead and 84 by 84. Let us center that to its parent. That looks good enough for this tutorial. So I want to go ahead and apply a stroke, and let's see here, the color's fine. I'll scrub in something like that. Ideally, the stroke would match the width of the elements of this plus sign here, but again, not overly concerned about it. And so that looks good for me for now. Actually, I want to change the fill to something not as bland. Let's see here, I don't know, something like that. Again, doesn't really matter for the sake of this tutorial. And I don't want to do a union selection. I'm going to group that, put it in a group just so I can move all the layers around a lot easier. Let's call that CTA, or I don't know, floating CTA. And let's say that we want to keep it here. And if provided that we don't change the dimension of this frame, this floating CTA is always going to, let's try that. This floating CTA is always going to stay right here. And it's this floating CTA group is a child of the parent frame called mobile screen. So everything is set up correctly over here. Now, when nothing is selected, we can't tell what the constraints look like. And when we click on the layer floating CTA, we see this, it's dotted. We see this dotted blue line vertically here and horizontally here. And that indicates where it is constraining itself to. And by that I mean, is it constraining itself to the left of the frame, left or the right, top or bottom? And these controls over here are reflective of what we see over here. So we have this top blue vertical line, which implies that this group of elements right here is constrained on the top. With regard to top and bottom is constrained to the top, and the horizontal line here with regard to left and right is constrained to the left. And that is further hammered home by the constraints section here in the design panel on the right hand side. This might have been easier to view in the light mode, but I'm enjoying Figma's dark mode. We can see that this icon, right, or this little box right here, shows us where the constraints are, and this is a darker blue right here because it's constraining itself to the top and to the left. You can quickly see that by looking over here at the constraints area. And if we wanted to switch the constraint, rather not from the top but from to the bottom, we just click here, and as you can tell, that is reinforced by the fact that there is no more vertical line coming off the top of this element, but now it's coming from the bottom, and I can move that center, and it's a lot easier to tell. So making changes over here reflects where the lines are over here. Now there are also, if you want to do left and right, you can click this drop down button, and left and right is an option. You can't select that by normal clicking. You would have to hold down, at least on a Mac, Command while left, for example, while left is selected. If you hold down Command and click here, it would also be left and right, which is reflected by the new wording here. You can also hold down Command to deselect it and just have left and bottom. But we're gonna go with the default right now, just to show you how this actually works. And so I'm going to drag it to sort of an arbitrary position in the parent, in the frame. I will then select the frame, and we can see whenever I change the width, it stays in place because its constraints are to the left and to the top. It's going to maintain this distance in pixels to the left and to the right. Possibly in a future update of Figma, you will be able to change the values here. It would be helpful, for example, if you could always set this to a percentage value, but for now it seems to be locked to a fixed value, or a fixed length, a fixed length between left and right, up and down. So possibly in a future update. And so we can tell that as we change the width and the height arbitrarily of this frame, this child object is constrained to hanging out in this corner, and we could also move it here. It doesn't really matter where you move it. You can see that it's going to be constrained to the top and to the bottom. But that's not always what we want, and so I'm gonna, what was that, like 300 by 600? There we go. So let's look at some of the other options as far as constraints are concerned. So, and to be very clear, constraints on the child are to the parent. That is sort of whatever the parent is what it's constraining itself to, if I did not make that clear. And let's say that, I don't know, let's put it in the middle there, directly in the middle, and we want to keep it in the middle no matter what we do. And so we look at the constraints area here in the design panel, and you feel free to click wherever you want to. The clickable area, the actionable area, is a bit small, which is an interesting accessibility issue that I just noticed Figma had. But you can also click the drop down and select center, and when you do that, this is the vertical constraint selector. The blue mark went from the top. Like if you set the top, you can see this blue right here, but if you select center, it goes to the center. And so you could also click here, and the horizontal constraint moved to the center, and so this is center, center. And so, whoop, there we go. Let's select the parent, and if we move it around, we can tell that it's always going to stay in the center, no matter what it looks like. You know, if it's a lot more wide than it is tall, again, it's going to have equal space here, equal space, or the space here is going to be the same as it is here, here to here, here to here, because I placed it in the middle to begin with. And same scenario here, if we make it a lot taller than it is wide, again, it stays in the middle. And so this is handy if you have an object that you want to stay centered, for example. But let's go back and make that 300, 600. Oop, I don't want to center it like that. There we go. Okay, so what is what is a good use case for this? Okay, well, let's say that we were working with a status bar or a tab bar or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that element so we can talk about something that we can work with some design elements, some design patterns that may be more realistic to what we might expect you know, in our actual day-to-day designs. And so let's create a bar of some sort. It could float at the top, it could float at the bottom, doesn't really matter. And so I will take my rectangle tool and I'm going to make this of arbitrary length. I know that this is 300, but we're going to make that, I don't know, let's make it 200 just to highlight. And I'm going to call this status bar. I'm going to give it a fill of something like that to make it very visible. And so it's neither parent, it's a child of the constraints. This element right here is a child of the constraints. Constraints is the parent of this element right here, the status bar, because it lives inside this frame. But when I drag it into this nested frame called mobile screen, it is now a child of mobile screen. It's still a child of the constraints, but it's more immediately a child of the mobile screen. And so if I select that, I can see what its constraints are right here. And so I'm going to move it to the top. And again, this is going to be a status bar. You know, I might have, if I were just designing this from scratch and not using a template, I might put the time up here, name of an app that's running. I might have a battery indicator icon, Wi-Fi settings, connectivity, 5G, whatever the case may be. And I want this, obviously, to maintain the same width as its parent, as the frame mobile screen. And so I place it at the top. And so this looks good for this one dimension. However, if I wanted to, you know, if the product owner said, okay, that looks fine, but we need to now design it for a Nest product or something that's, you know, the frame size would be wider. You say, okay, well, I will first start by widening the frame, and oh no, as you can see, the status bar element does not widen with it. It's staying the same width. So that's not going to work. And so what you could do is, we'll do Control Z to get back where we were. You could select the child element called status bar, and this is where constraints come into play. This is a good example of how to use constraints. So we want to keep it sort of stuck to the top. That's fine. The status bar doesn't really move around in applications. It might disappear, but it doesn't move around. It's either stuck to the top or hidden most of the time. And so I also like that it's stuck to the left. So if I expand it in this direction, or I just expanded it in both directions, it is of course stuck to the left of its parent. And we know that because looking over here, this blue horizontally stuck to the left side of its parent, or it's stuck however far I placed it. Like even if I placed it there and it wasn't, I should probably stop saying stuck because that's giving the wrong impression, but it's keeping this distance fixed. And if it wasn't exactly butting up against the edge of this frame, it would still maintain its consistent distance from the left-hand side, because left is chosen. That is what the constraint is that we're dealing with. And again, you can tell that that is the case by merely looking at it. If you select this element and look at the canvas, you select the element in the layers panel, look at the canvas, you can see that there is this horizontal blue dashed icon to show that it is constrained to the left side. It's also constrained to the top, but because it's butting up against the very top of the frame, there is no line to draw. And so let's say that we wanted to make sure that, let's do that, there we go. We wanted to have the status bar scale with the frame no matter what. So we would select the status bar, which is of course a child. Mobile screen is, let's do this. Center that, there we go. So we'll select status bar, child of the parent called mobile screen. And we want to make sure that that constrains to both sides, both the left side, which it currently is, but again, we can tell it's not constrained to the right side. So we can either, if we hold down Command on a Mac keyboard and click here, it says now left and right. Alternatively, if it says left, you can click the drop down and now it says left and right. So now it's constraining itself to this left side of the frame as well as the right side. And we can, and the frame, this frame itself, the parent frame mobile screen, of course, like everything has a constraint. I don't think you can tell something not to have a constraint. In fact, let's see if we can do that. Oh, I guess we can. Either way, it'll just be floating in space. We can tell that the parent frame mobile screen, it is constrained to its parent frame, which is just this page I have called, or not page, this frame I have called constraints, which is just sort of like I designed like this to look like more like an interactive slideshow. If we select the mobile screen and we change the, there we go. Let's do status bar. Right, so I didn't tell it to be, let's make that 300, and we want to select this element, the status bar, and we'll hold down Command and click, and now it's constrained to the left and right. Again, you can click the drop down, select left and right, and now when we resize this frame, there we go. Now it's staying constrained to both sides. And if we want to visualize that a bit different, or if we wanted to sort of demystify this, if it is mystifying just a little bit, we'll select the status bar child element, and we'll go ahead and reduce its width a little bit here. You can tell that there's a, you can see that there's a dashed line, a dashed horizontal blue line on the right-hand side, constraining it position-wise to the right side of the parent frame called mobile screen, as well as the left side. And so even though I didn't make it the exact width, if we wanted to have sort of a modern looking status bar at the top that didn't, there's a little bit of a gutter on each side, that's when we can do that. And this also proves that it's keeping its constraints as it ought to. And so that's an example of how left and right works. Top, of course, has top and bottom, which does a bit of the same thing. It will, top and bottom will keep its same constraints here and here, although interestingly, yeah, you'll notice that when I change the frame size, because it's maintaining the, let's click here so you can see what I'm talking about. So it's constrained top and bottom, left and right, and it's not exactly center. There we go. Because because these constraint selections make it such that it always has this fixed value between the top and the right, left, or the top and the bottom, left and the right. It is, some odd things can happen when you start resizing the frame. And so if I stretch it, if I make it shorter, it also gets shorter, because it's going to maintain the same amount of space here to here, and the way it maintains that space is well, if the frame's shrinking, I have to shrink is sort of how it's thinking, because the number one important thing is maintaining the distance here. And so it'll actually inverse on itself. And so you can get some interesting effects here, just something to be careful of when you're using constraints. But otherwise, very useful when you're placing items like status bars, floating CTAs, things of that nature. And yeah, very powerful when you're making products for multiple screen widths, heights, all sorts of things like that, where you don't want to repeat yourself over and over and over again. You want to set it once and not have to worry about it. Again, that's sort of an example of a way to keep your designs as dry as possible. Keep it simple and do not repeat yourself. That's work smarter, not harder. And so let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and move that back where it was. And so if you give me one moment, I'm going to take a gander at the chat and make sure I'm not missing anything. I doubt highly that I am, but let's take a gander here. And again, I appreciate you joining me this evening to go over some of these tutorial bits. Very fun time as ever. And let's see here. Okay, very cool. And so the next subject for this evening is we're going to talk about auto layout, another very useful addition to Figma. And they actually made some changes to auto layout in the latest release. I haven't read the change logs. I don't know exactly what they are. I do know that the interface looks a little bit different. It came in the same update, if I remember correctly, as the option to turn on dark mode, which is why my Figma's dark like this as my system settings. And we're going to explore some of the issues. That was sort of a bit of a foreshadowing there. We're going to explore a little bit how auto layout works and how we can take advantage of it. And if you remember during the first exercise, components, I did use auto layout a bit when I was designing these buttons, but now we'll go into sort of the nuts and bolts of how this works. So some of the basics of auto layout. In order to create an object that has auto layout, or an element that has auto layout, you're going to need more than one object or more than one element in a layer, and I'll show you what that means. And that's embarrassing. There we go. It's very powerful because it allows you to create very dynamic looking buttons where you can quickly alter the padding, the space between items, and the alignment, much like you would be able to in HTML or using some CSS, which is a bit of a secret of how Figma was built. And so we will start by go ahead and we'll dive right in. So it requires more than one object. So if I wanted to make auto layout that included and I'm going to place a rectangle, or I'll place an ellipse. So click, my default is this gray color, 100 by 100, and I wanted to, that, and I wanted to do some sort of auto layout with just this one object. That's not going to work. And I can tell it's not going to work because over here, I think it's either above constraints or below constraints in the design panel. There's a section called auto layout, and it'll have a plus or an addition symbol over to the right where you can add an auto layout. However, that action is absent because we only have one element selected. As you can tell, there's only one layer selected. And so let's create another element. So let's call that circle. And let's add another element to the mix to see what we're dealing with, or see how we can use auto layout. So I will go over here on my shapes drop down. I will create a rectangle which has the same dimension of 100 by 100. These are just the Figma defaults. And you see, or as you can tell when I select both of these items over here, okay, it's above constraints. Now we have this new section, auto layout, and Figma doesn't automatically add an auto layout when you select multiple objects, because that would be terrible. But it now gives you the option that you have because you have more than one object. And something that I was figuring out right before I started the live stream was how it knows if I want to add an auto layout. How does it know to give me the option? Well, what are what these two elements, what these two shapes have in common is they are on they're centered to each other along the horizontal axis. And because it gets the idea that these two things might have the opportunity to be included in auto layout, and it gives me that option over here. What if I select two items that are sort of far away from each other, they're not along the same axes with each other, and I can tell just by holding down the option key here that they do not share an axis. If I have these selected, interestingly, auto layout is no longer available above constraints, even though it meets the requirement of greater than one object. Well, what's up with that? Okay, and I after a minute of experimenting with this earlier, I found out what it takes. And so to make this very clear, I'll get rid of the oval, and I keep calling it an oval, it's an ellipse. I'll get rid of the ellipse and I'll create another rectangle. And so when they share an axis, that is to say they are aligned on the vertically, select both of them, we have auto layout. Okay, so if it's off by a bit, like it's off by half of the width of this one, this rectangle is 50% to the right of this, roughly, there you go. It's 50% to the right of this rectangle. If I select both of them, auto layout's still an option. Okay, at what point, and this is probably not that important, but I just wanted to pass this on because I didn't see this anywhere else, at how far away along the y-axis do these need to be separated from each other for Figma to no longer give us the option to do an auto layout? So these are sort of still on top of each other. What if we move them like this, where this top rectangle is not at all in any way, shape, or form on top of this bottom rectangle? And I can tell by zooming in to, what is this? 24,594%, that they are in no way, the only way they touch right here is at this tiny little corner. Okay, well, can I still get an auto layout? You can. Here's the interesting thing, and this would be the same thing with an ellipse. I just wanted to make it a lot more apparent by using two rectangles. So these are not separate. These are separated by basically 0 pixels, but we still have the option for auto layout. If I'm going to tap the right arrow on my keyboard, if I move that one, and you can't even tell on the screen, I'm sure, if I move that 1 pixel to the right, okay, well that was not working earlier for me. That's interesting. That's why. Okay. So provided that they're more than 1 pixel away from each other, that's the point at which you no longer get the auto constraint. Or sorry, the auto layout option. And so there's, these are touching right on this corner. If I drag this one down, they're still sharing this axis, but only barely. Their bounding boxes, let's see here. Their bounding boxes touch a little bit. Still gives me the option for auto layout, but if I move it 1 pixel up, the bounding boxes are sort of still share just this tiny slice of the vertical axis. It will give me the option to do auto layout. However, if I move it just 1 pixel away in both axes, no more auto layout. So if you're wondering why sometimes it gives you the option and sometimes it doesn't, that is why. I could have explained that better. My apologies, but I just wanted to share what I found. It sounded better in my head, to be sure. So back to the original lesson here. We'll place an ellipse, and let's see here. Let's say I wanted to, there we go. Let's say I wanted to apply an auto layout. Well, easy enough. We can come over here and select auto layout, and clicking it now gives us all sorts of, or gives us a selection of new options available. And let's look at the auto layout area first under the design panel on the right hand side of Figma. So starting in this area over here, this is the direction in which things are aligned, and it'll detect what direction you want things in. These were side by side horizontally, so it knows that you probably want things to run horizontally, so it automatically chooses the horizontal direction. You can change that by clicking the vertical direction, or the down arrow here, and you can cycle between the two, but we're going to go ahead and keep it moving horizontally. And this next option down here, which has the double-headed arrow, so we can scrub this value, and I say that over and over. Scrubbing is when you use this double-headed arrow and you click, hold, and then move the mouse around, and you can see while I move, holding down the button, the mouse button, that's sort of a way to alter the difference or the distance between the objects. The way of doing this is called scrubbing. Of course, you can also be more granular if you know exactly what you want this to look like. Up, down buttons, you could type it in. You could type it in exactly. You could also hold down, let's see here, Shift to move by increments of 10. Whatever that happens to look like for you, or however you want to use that, is completely up to you. Scrubbing is very useful if you're making a wild change, or if the change you're making is arbitrary, just to show how something works. And so what I am changing here, if you do a mouse over, it'll say spacing between items. And what I'm changing by changing this value here is exactly what it says on the tin. It's the spacing between the items. Items being each layer, and you'll also, or each layer object, each object in the auto layout. And you'll notice when let's see here, we'll get rid of that auto layout. So observe here on the, why is that a frame? Let's do this. I'm gonna redo that. Okay, so now we have these two shapes just hanging out over here in the layers panel on the left-hand side. Both of these are shapes. They are children of the parent called auto layout. Let's rename these. We don't really, ooh, that's not a circle, that's a square. All squares are rectangles. I am aware of that. But we're gonna mix and mash up our terms. And so we have these two elements right here, and we click auto layout. So notice what happens to your two layer items over here. As it stands, they're just two elements, they're sort of siblings, and that one's not the parent or the child of the other. But when we select both of them and add an auto layout, see what happened. It put them into a frame, and it named itself frame 1, which is how I know it's a frame. And so frames also are of a group type, and so they're grouped as, now they're children of the parent called frame 1. We'll just rename that auto layout example. It also gives each frame type has, or each group or frame type has slightly different iconography, and so here it's using this icon right here, which is refers to how things are aligned. And when you have objects that go in the y-axis as well, or the x-axis as well as the y-axis, this will become of more importance. But let's say that we put it here, center by center, or center on both axes, and this will be right aligned in the center. The point is, whatever you click here, wherever your alignment is, if you look here on the layers panel on the right hand side of Figma, it's going to update that icon to display, or it's going to display what sort of layout alignment you have. So it's another visual indicator that you can quickly look over here at the layers, and if you didn't have it selected, you wouldn't know what your alignment was. But if you look here, you can say, okay, it's centered alignment. And let's see here, which doesn't this area right here doesn't mean a whole lot right at this moment, because these two elements have the same dimensions, they have the same height, which is what's important right now. And there's more than one way to, and you'll notice when I do a mouse over of the spacing between items area, which is, of course, let's set that to 60 for numbers that are pleasing. When we mouse over, in the middle on the canvas, in the frame, we can see it has this pink striped area. That's a visual indication, and it disappears when you take your mouse away. By mousing over, it tells you what you are editing or what you're making changes to. Another way of changing this value right here, the distance between the items, is to, if you select the frame, which is the auto layout frame, which by selecting the parent, it also selects the child elements, and we put our mouse over this area, that is to say the area that corresponds to the space between items, we'll see that it also becomes, it has this pink pinstripe. And I'm not sure how, yes, that's not easy to see at all. Okay, maybe that's a bit better. There's also this vertical line that's right in the middle, and it might be hard to see on the stream. I apologize if that's the case. You can also see it on the right here, this little sort of to the right of my cursor. There's that pink, that sort of short pink line. It's in the middle between these two objects. It's at the top, the bottom, and again here on the left hand side to the left. This is another way of changing your padding on the top and the bottom, your padding on the right and the left, as well as another way to change the distance between items, or the space between items. And you can change this when you get this icon, when you get this pointer right here, you can click and drag, so you can scrub the value here. And when you just click, a little, I guess that's a modal, also appears right here, so you can quickly type in a value. And so there's, like most things in Figma, like most things in other design tools, there are multiple ways of making changes. Not one way is better than another, in the sense that your outcome is going to be the same. What I mean is, if my goal, if my task was to update the distance between the items, and I knew exactly what the number was that I wanted, I could come over here, click, let's say, I don't like 30, I'm not feeling 30, 36, that's where it's at. I could type it in. I could also scrub it in, and that would, of course, my ability to do that would be dependent on mouse sensitivity, mouse acceleration, so on and so forth. And you can tell that it took me slightly longer to scrub in exactly the figure that I wanted compared to just typing in 3/6 and striking the enter key. And you can also click here, start typing, and it would update it up here in this little window, this little box, this modal. So there's multiple ways of doing things that are equal in the sense that the outcome is the same. However, one may take more time to perform than the other. That depends on what you're doing. And so take these into consideration. And you might say, well, Bill, what was the difference in time there? Less than a second, maybe a second and a half. Fair. And for a tutorial like this, that may not really add up to much in the end. However, if you're working on if you're trying to design a deliverable like a clickable prototype, and you're working on this thing for 8 hours a day for months, or whatever the case may be, however that might look like, those seconds add up. And you'll want to, again, keep it simple and Work smarter, not harder. So know the different ways to make adjustments. I would also suggest mastering keyboard shortcuts. It's one of those things that, in and of itself, each keyboard shortcut doesn't save much time compared to right-clicking and accessing the menu, or you could press R to get the rectangle, or you could come up here and just click rectangle. These things do add up, especially on the longer designs you're working on. And so let's talk about some of the controls that we have with the auto layout, getting back to where we were. And so we'll select the parent, which is called auto layout example, children, square, and circle. This itself is a child element of parent auto layout. And we've talked extensively about the distance, or the spacing between items, as Figma calls it, so we can change that. And we can also change the padding. Padding is space that is on top of, on bottom of, left and right. And it separates top and bottom from left and right. So if we want to, let's put a fill on this to make it clear what I'm talking about here. There we go. Sorry for the garish colors, y'all. And so let's select the parent with children, square, and circle. Auto layout is here because, as we can tell, this is an auto layout frame. And we are changing the padding of the left and the right. And as I scrub this number back and forth, the distance between the two items does not change. However, let's center that. The padding changes, which is the space to the left of the rectangle object, and to the right of the ellipse element or object. And that is because there aren't any other objects over here. If there was another shape over here, then the padding would be, the right-hand padding would be to the right of that. And I guess a good way to prove that would be, let's throw a polygon in here. And you can, I'll explain how that worked momentarily. And so I'm going to recenter this, and again, because space between items is not affected by padding, no matter how many items you have in a row or in a column, this only affects the space to the to all the way to the right or all the way to the left. So that's one way to edit your padding. And let's see, let's make that 150. And so there is padding for the top and bottom, that is the vertical padding, which does exactly the same thing as the horizontal padding. And so if I click and scrub, again, exact same thing. And so this is, if you caught it when I briefly set up the button for the components, I was using, as you can see here, I was using auto layout to change the spacing between the top and the bottom, the left and the right. The padding is what that's called. And that's how you give your text or your imagery in a button or an input field or really anything else breathing space. A little bit of, it's sort of a type of white space, I guess you could think about it. You want to make sure it's not too cramped by your elements inside the button or inside the frame getting too close to the edge, unless that's the motif of your design. Follow your design, but you don't want anything too small or too shrunken in. And by that I mean you want to have a good amount of space between top, bottom, left, right. Like if this were somehow what the design was going to look like, the padding on the top and the bottom, that might be fine, but like this is way too much for the left and the right. Again, depending on design. And if you want to, this is pretty cool. You can, let's say, you say, Bill, that sounds all well and good, but what if I want to change the padding on just the top or just the right? Well, there's two ways of going about doing that. And so when you have the group selected, that is auto layout, and it has the polygon, let's just call that triangle. let's see here. So if we wanted to change just one of these parameters, and you have the parent selected, and you have your mouse over, you will see that you can, of course, use these controls to change the space in between, but you also notice these top and bottom controls. Now, unlike the control for spacing between, you can click and drag here and scrub the distance. It's always going to be the same between. If I change it over here, it's going to be reflected on this side. If I change it over here, it's going to be reflected on that side. That's the spacing. The spacing between the items is always going to be the same no matter how many items you have. It has to be the same. However, that is not the case for the padding on top, bottom, top right, bottom left. And we'll notice that because I was scrubbing these, it moves. It is keeping the padding on both the left and the right is keeping them exactly the same. However, if I select the parent item or the parent layer, and this right here is actually, I'll tell you what, let's make that slightly easier. That's a lot easier to see. Okay, so this area that my mouse is over it's pink, it's hard to tell, it almost looks purple. The purple pinstripe here, and this handle right here, this controls the padding for the right. You'll notice it does not control the padding for the left. When you mouse over an area where you can control, that has a handle that you can make changes to, like this is the space between items. If I'm in this area, the right to the right of the circle, and I put my cursor here, both this area to the right of the circle as well as this area over here to the left of the circle get this pinstripe effect. That indicates that I'm making a change to both of them at the same time. Not the case when I put my cursor over here. This is the handle that controls just the right side padding, and so I could have padding of 0 or wildly greater than the one on the left. And if you wanted to type that in, if you didn't want to scrub, but you had an exact number that you wanted to work with, you'll notice that when I change this so that the padding on the right is different than that of the padding on the left, and let's see here, and we select, that's weird, I feel like it should have done that. Okay, yeah, so previously there was a it added 2 buttons. We now have a right padding, bottom padding, top padding, left padding, instead of 2 areas we can click and scrub in or type in just for left, right, top, bottom. Because I made changes to this one right here, it added 2 more, so we can, it added options for, right and bottom, because we changed them. And let's see here. If you wanted to, and you'll notice by clicking here is similar or has the exact same function as this corner radius. We can control what each corner radius value is by clicking here. And by clicking here, we can change independently left, top, right, and bottom padding. And when we collapse this to where it's just a single row rather than 2 rows, there's a comma between the value, and this is horizontal padding. The first number here, 107, is in reference to the left number of pixels that's padding in this auto layout, and 133 is this one on the right. And of course we can prove that by moving this much larger, and we can see that this is 107 to 80. If you keep your eye on this area while I change or while I alter this, or while I scrub it, you can see that the number after the comma changes. However, the 107 doesn't change because using this handle, I'm not making any change to that or the padding over here. If I was, it would look like this. But again, multiple ways of changing the padding. But if I just want the same padding on each, I'll just put an arbitrary value in of 100. It resets it to 100 on both sides, and I can tell just by looking here that vertical padding top and bottom is 16 on each. To prove that, we can click this so it shows top down bottom right, left top right bottom, 100 100 16 16. So it's just another way of visualizing this. And let's see here. This is very useful when you're making buttons that have multiple elements in the frame. For example, let's see here. Oh, and so this is pretty cool too. If you wanted to, let's say that you created your auto layout frame, but then you thought, oh, I want to add something to the frame, but I didn't create it with all the, if you made a mistake or you had an idea later that you wanted to add an element to the auto layout frame, well, let's see here. All you have to do is take the element, the layer that you want to add, and you click it and drag it. When you click and drag this, and I'm just holding down the mouse button here, you can see that there's this tall, sort of wide-ish blue line. That shows, when I drag this layer onto the frame, the layer disappears. It has this sort of dotted outline, which means it's going to reappear as a child of the frame. It's going to appear on the right side or the left side. And so let's say I wanted to put it on the left side. So now this is a parent that has two children. One's called text, one's called square. And let's move that over here. You can have shapes in here as well as text, as well as images. And so this would be a way to, I can change the spacing between items. I think that's a bit extreme. Let's move it down to something like that. Try to make it square. You can make a button that has, an icon right here. This could be anything. Let's make an icon. Let's make a button with text and icon right quick. So I just happen to have Google's material design icons open, which, by the way, if you aren't using this, or if you're looking for an icon pack, I very much suggest material design icons, which you can find by searching the community in Figma, and it has multiple, it has a ton of variants. I was using Filled for my design project, but they also have, outlined versions, rounded versions. The two-tone is really cool. I wanted to use these, but it did not fit the design aesthetic that I was working with. But we'll go ahead and choose a filled, and actually, let's go for a rounded. We're going to, let's see here. It doesn't matter. We'll choose any icon. Apparently this is called contactless. So we'll copy, and as you can see, based on the tutorial earlier, all of these are components. So I was able to quickly place, what is this, hundreds, maybe 1,000 icons just with a Shift-I in my design. Made everything a lot easier. And so I copied contactless, and I couldn't place it as an instance over here because these are separate projects, and not being local, it wouldn't be able to see it. But I'm going to go ahead and paste that here. There's our icon. It's a vector, of course, rather than a raster image, and you can tell just by zooming in to 25,600% sharp as a tack. And so let's do, there we go. And if I want to, let's see, I wanted to resize this to something that looks about right. That's a little bit too tall. Let's try, I don't know, something like that. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. If I drag it, I could drag it into this frame, and now it is part, as you can see here, it'd be nicer if this was an instance, but you get the idea. That this component is now part of, it's now a child of a parent frame called auto layout example, which, as we can see over here, has auto layout applied. And if we wanted to, we could, change the space between. You can actually make it negative if you want to. If you wanted to do some, depending on what your design specifications called for, you can make some cool effects that way. And so I'm going to, I'm stuck on 8 for some reason. We'll make the difference between them 8. And actually, let's see here. Let's say that for whatever reason, you didn't like the alignment. That is to say, the icon is aligned to the middle of this text here. Well, that's definitely something that you could change with the auto layout. As you can see here, it's in the center. I have center alignment, and we could change. This is there's more to cover as far as the alignment's concerned, but those are for sort of more complex auto layouts. So when we have just a limited number of items or limited number of layers in a linear axis, that is to say, there's well, anyway, you can align it to the top or to the bottom, and I like the way that, and of course the way I'm doing that is just clicking over here, and I like the way, you know, middle or center alignment looks. And so I'll select just that component, go back over here, sort of undo what I did, make it a bit bigger. And of course, all of the icons in this set aren't 0000000 black. They're sort of a bit of a gray color. But obviously, looking at that, that's not going to work for both of these. And so if I wanted to change the color of these en masse, I would just select the auto layout frame. I see the selection colors, which is all the colors that are all the colors of the elements under different effects. Like if there was a stroke on any of these, a stroke color would show up here as well. But I have zeros, I have black and then gray. But let's say I wanted to change that gray to black. I would just click here. I would just type 0, press enter. That's a bit of a shortcut there. And so I have this button, which is sort of coming along, and that's not exactly the size I want, and so that better be constrained. It is constrained. That looks a bit better. Of course, I could get exactly pixel perfect if I want to, but that's not of interest to me right now. Let's see here. We'll go ahead and give auto layout example a bit of a let's change that to listen. Let's make that medium, and let's see here. So we have a button that we created using auto layout that we could easily edit any of the padding that we wanted to, depending on, you know, what we wanted this to look like. And let's see here. As a matter of fact, one thing to keep in mind, let's say, there we go. So the padding is equal on all sides on this button. Top, bottom, left, and right both have a value of 20. However, just because they're equal does not always mean that it's going to look correct. There is such a thing as like visual alignment, and so if you thought that it looked off but your math worked out or all these numbers matched, you know, always rely on your eyes rather than the figures. So if you thought that might look better at like maybe 18, or, you know, just change the pixels just a little bit, you know, you're the designer, you make the decision. And for example, I can tell that there's less space between the in and the end of the frame as there is between the top and the bottom of the characters, the glyphs here, or the bottom of the L. There's more space here than there is here, and it's, you know, this almost looks like, I was about to call this a Spotify icon, but that's not exactly correct. It's contactless. I guess that's NFC. There's, you know, the space between here and here, bounding box is the same between here and here, but it does look a little bit off, so you can change that as you see fit. And so, you know, we started making a button here that we could turn this into a component if we wanted to, but we'll go ahead and continue. I just want to continue this out for whatever reason. Let's go ahead and we'll give it a drop shadow. I am not a super fan of drop shadows. I understand why they're useful. They give an impression of like height or hierarchy. However, I think they kind of look played out. I mean, like drop shadows, box shadows were cool when I was making websites in like 2000. But anyway, you can do a lot of cool stuff with box shadows. And so let's say there are many ways to create height and depth without having, you know, a gradiated box shadow. So I'm gonna do something like that. That's fine. Let's go there. Yeah, something like that. Maybe 16. There we go. So there's a button which you could animate to where, if you click it, it would it would transform down to the right a little bit, which would give you a sort of a feeling of not necessarily operating just in the second dimension, but that would sort of add a 3D feel to it. But animations are for another day, of course, because that's an entirely different conversation. And so that is a bit of an introduction about how auto layout works. Now, there are a couple things I glossed over, a couple things that I didn't mention because it would take far too long in this live stream this evening, and of course I didn't want to take up too much time because I know everyone's time is very valuable, especially if you have units to work on and things of that nature. So I just wanted to cover sort of the basics. There's a lot of good videos on YouTube about how to do this. Certainly the information is more condensed. I'm just I don't have a script. I'm just freestyling how to do this. So what took me 20 or 30 minutes to explain, there's some really great YouTubers who can do it scripted in about 5, and great stuff there. But hopefully this helped. And of course, if there's any additional questions, any concerns with anything I said, of course, I am on the Springboard Slack, Bill Ricks. You can just send me a direct message. We can chat. If there's any additional, I will continue to live stream in the future. I do enjoy doing this. If there's any topic ideas or anything of that nature, let me know, and we can discuss what would work best. I did enjoy this. Again, hit me up with any questions or concerns. If you want to be notified for any future live streams, go ahead and subscribe for notifications on Twitch. And let me know if there's anything I can do, anything I can miss. And have a fantastic evening.